Hey, movie nerds! Today we're stepping into My Oxford Year, a 2025 romantic drama that explores the fragile intersection between ambition and love, between the life we thought we were building and the one we stumble into unexpectedly. A story that asks us to look deeper, to question, and to feel beyond the surface. I'm glad you're here because together we'll unravel the hidden layers, the subtle details, and the little moments that whisper the heart of the film. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep exploring these stories that shape how we see the world. Now settle in, open your mind, and let's dive into the depths of this cinematic journey. It begins the way some of the most compelling stories do, not with a whirlwind of action, but with a shift in setting, a protagonist stepping across the invisible threshold into a new world. There's something intoxicating about the idea of uprooting your life for a year, of letting your surroundings shape who you are, of breathing in air that's both foreign and strangely familiar. Here that new world is Oxford, with its centuries-old spires, cobblestone lanes, and the soft weight of history pressing in from every side. The film draws you into this atmosphere immediately, light glancing off wet pavement, the muffled hush of footsteps in old libraries, the contrast between the grandeur of tradition and the intimacy of daily life. At the heart of it all is a young American woman who's come to the university not for romance, but for opportunity. She's sharp, driven, and unashamed of her ambition, carrying with her a plan that seems almost bulletproof. Finish her studies, build her career, and return home with both experience and accolades. But what's so fascinating is the way the story begins to tease out the cracks in that plan, not in the sense of failure, but in the sense of life's refusal to stay neatly contained. We watch her navigate the formalities of academia while also trying to find her footing socially, the film layering in moments of quiet humor and understated longing that make her instantly relatable. The plot at first glance seems like it might follow familiar beats. Girl meets boy, romance blooms, complications arise. But here, the narrative resists cliché by leaning into the texture of those complications, rather than simply using them as stepping stones. The boy in question is not the kind of figure one might expect. He's not the overpolished romantic lead with perfect answers to every question. Instead, he's charming in a way that feels lived in, a little messy around the edges, carrying his own unspoken weight. Their first encounter is awkward and tinged with rivalry, sparking a dynamic that becomes the backbone of the story. Mutual curiosity wrapped in a tug-of-war between personal goals and the pull of human connection. There's a particular thrill in the way the film unfolds its middle act. The tension isn't just about whether they'll end up together, it's about what together even means when both people are standing at such defining crossroads in their lives. Scenes glide between warm intimacy, shared dinners in cramped college flats, laughter echoing down narrow streets after too much wine, and moments of sharp reality, where responsibilities and commitments back home press in like unwelcome shadows. The dialogue here is one of the film's quiet strengths, written with the kind of honesty that feels unafraid of awkward silences or half-finished sentences. It's in those silences that the real truths seep through. As the story deepens, you start to feel the tug of something more than romance. There's an undercurrent of mortality, of impermanence that colors their time together. Little hints, a look held too long, a pause before answering, a sudden change in tone, suggest that not everything is as it seems. The script plants these seeds with deliberate subtlety, so that when revelations finally arrive, they feel both surprising and inevitable. The joy of the early chapters is tempered by an awareness that some things, once uncovered, will change everything. Oxford itself becomes more than just a setting, it's a character in its own right. The way the camera lingers on the ripples in the river during a lazy afternoon punt, the shifting light in the cloisters, the muffled echo of distant church bells, these details root the story in a space that feels alive, breathing alongside its characters. The beauty of this approach is that it mirrors the emotional journey of the protagonists. Just as the city holds centuries of layered history, so too do they carry the layers of their past and present into every interaction. What's especially moving is the way the film never treats love as a magic solution to life's problems. Instead, it leans into the bittersweet truth that love can complicate as much as it can complete. Choices have to be made about careers, about geography, about what kind of life you want to build, and those choices aren't made in a vacuum. There's a sense of realism here that gives the romance weight. It's not about perfection, but about navigating the imperfect with as much grace as you can muster. By the time the story moves toward its turning points, the audience is already invested not just in the outcome, but in the journey itself. There's a looming awareness that the end of the year will come, that departures are inevitable, and that even the most perfect day is only perfect because it can't last forever. The emotional stakes rise quietly, not with melodramatic declarations, but with small acts that carry disproportionate weight, a hand brushed against in passing, an argument left unresolved, a letter left unread. And then the hints from earlier begin to crystallize into something undeniable. The romantic tension is suddenly reframed in light of deeper revelations, the kind that don't just shift the tone, but recontextualize everything you've seen so far. You begin to realize that this has never been a story about simply falling in love. It's been a story about what you do when love collides with the finite nature of time, about how you hold on without holding someone back, about the courage it takes to love fully knowing it might not last. This is where the film's true power lies, in its refusal to treat love as either a fairy tale or a tragedy, but as a living, breathing experience shaped by all the complexities of being human. It's in the way it asks whether ambition and intimacy can coexist without one dimming the other. It's in the way it forces you to confront the truth that even the most transformative relationships might be temporary, and that this doesn't make them any less profound. The final stretch of the narrative is masterful in its balance. There's resolution, yes, but not the tidy kind that ties everything into a neat bow. Instead, it leaves room for the audience to feel the full weight of the choices made, to sit with both the joy and the ache. In the end, it's not about whether the relationship worked out in the conventional sense. It's about the way it changed them, the way it will continue to echo through the rest of their lives. And when the credits finally roll, there's a sense of having lived something alongside these characters. You've walked their streets, felt the shifting of their seasons, shared in their laughter and their quiet heartbreaks. You've been reminded that life rarely goes to plan, that the most significant detours are often the ones we never saw coming, and that the beauty of a moment isn't diminished by its impermanence. What lingers most is a single truth. Sometimes the year you thought would define your career ends up defining your heart instead, and sometimes that's the lesson you were meant to learn all along. The story opens in a way that feels deceptively simple, the way the beginning of a quiet chapter in a book can carry the weight of everything that's to come. The air feels crisp and unfamiliar as she steps off the bus, suitcase in hand, onto the ancient streets that have outlasted empires. The hum of life here is different, slower in some ways, richer in others. She is arriving for a year that she has mapped out with almost mathematical precision, her mind balancing academic deadlines, research goals, and a long-distance professional commitment she has promised herself she will not neglect. She has always been the kind of person who thrives on structure, who finds comfort in ticking boxes off a list. Her first glimpse of the college where she'll be staying is a lesson in contrasts. The stone walls loom, not in an intimidating way, but in a way that reminds her she's entering something that existed long before she was born and will continue long after she leaves. Inside, she's greeted with the bustle of students already forming clusters in the common room, voices carrying a medley of accents. There's a mix of warmth and competition in the air, a sense that while friendships will be forged, there's also an unspoken hierarchy of intellect, ambition, and charisma. Her first days are spent learning the rhythm of this new life. Mornings begin with breakfast in a dining hall that looks like it belongs in a medieval novel, afternoons dissolve into lectures, and evenings bring a mix of solitary study and hesitant socializing. She keeps to herself at first, watching more than speaking, scanning for a sense of where she might fit. Then comes the moment that tilts her trajectory, a meeting that's almost laughably unremarkable in the moment. A group assignment in a seminar brings her into conversation with him. He's not particularly charming in the practiced way some people are. Instead, there's a self-assuredness that makes his silences as comfortable as his words. Their first exchange is a volley of sharp comments over the interpretation of a poem, both unwilling to concede the point. Something in her, the competitive streak she tries to keep in check, sparks at this. Later she'll look back and realize that spark was the first sign that her tidy plans might not survive the year intact. Their paths cross again, this time in a less formal setting. She's sitting in a cafe tucked down a side street, half hidden by stacks of books when he appears. He asks if he can join her, and though she tells herself she's doing it to be polite, there's a flicker of curiosity she can't quite extinguish. Their conversation shifts from literature to life, childhood memories, future aspirations, moments they've never shared with strangers before. The world outside the cafe window seems to fade, replaced by the electricity of a conversation that feels like it's been waiting to happen. Over the next few weeks, their encounters multiply. Some are accidental, passing each other in the library stacks, bumping into one another in the quad, but others are not. They begin to carve out time deliberately, whether it's sharing lunch in the courtyard or walking along the river in the golden hour light. She notices how easy it is to lose track of time with him, how her mind, once rigidly focused on her own agenda, now drifts to thoughts of what they might talk about next. Still, life here is not a perfect bubble. There are undercurrents of tension, both academic and personal. The workload is relentless, and she finds herself stretched thin, trying to balance her commitments with the increasing pull of this connection. Friends back home send messages asking how she's adjusting, and she answers with vague reassurances, leaving out the parts about how her evenings are now punctuated by the sound of his laughter. She tells herself she's still in control, that she can keep her priorities straight. Then one evening, he invites her to a small gathering at his flat. It's nothing extravagant, just a handful of friends, a table littered with mismatched plates and glasses, but it's the first time she sees him in his own world. There's an ease in the way he moves here, a quiet confidence that draws others in. At one point, she catches him watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable but intent. Later, when the night winds down and the others have left, they linger in the kitchen, the conversation dipping into more vulnerable territory. It's here, in the hush between words, that she feels the unmistakable shift from acquaintance to something deeper. The days that follow are a blend of exhilaration and uncertainty. There are moments when everything feels impossibly right, a shared umbrella in a sudden downpour, a heated debate over dinner that ends in laughter, but there are also shadows creeping in at the edges. He seems to pull away sometimes, retreating into himself with no explanation. She notices things now, the way he avoids certain topics, the sudden change in his expression when his phone buzzes. Her curiosity sharpens, though she tells herself she's not prying. She begins to realize that whatever is growing between them exists alongside something she can't yet name. And the more she leans into the connection, the more aware she becomes of time, how quickly the weeks are slipping by, how this year already feels like it's moving too fast. There's a pivotal afternoon when they visit a nearby village. They wander through narrow streets lined with old stone cottages, duck into a bookshop that smells of dust and possibility, and find themselves sitting by the fire in a pub as rain lashes the windows. The world outside feels distant, as though they've stepped into a pocket of time that belongs only to them. He tells her something then, not everything, but enough to shift the air between them. It's a small confession, almost an apology, about a past choice he still carries. It's not the whole truth, but it's a door left ajar. From that point, the stakes feel higher. Every glance holds more weight. Every conversation seems to skirt the edges of something unspoken. She can't help but wonder what it is he's not telling her, and why she feels both compelled to know and afraid of the answer. Their connection has deepened, yes, but with it comes the quiet hum of foreboding. The first half of the story builds this intricate web of intimacy and hesitation, of joy tinged with something that resists being named. She is still in control, or at least she believes she is, but the ground beneath her feet is shifting. And though she doesn't yet see the full shape of it, she can sense that whatever lies ahead will ask her to choose between the life she planned and the life that's beginning to take shape right in front of her. It starts quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the universe has decided that the most consequential shifts should arrive without fanfare. The days grow shorter, the air cooler, and somewhere between essays and late-night conversations, she realizes that the year she once imagined as a structured academic chapter has transformed into something far messier, more human, and far more fragile. The undercurrent of unease that had been humming beneath their connection begins to rise, shaping itself into moments she can't quite ignore. There's an evening, late in term, when they meet for a walk along the river. The fog is thick enough to blur the outlines of the city, muting the glow of the lamps into soft halos. He's quieter than usual, and when she finally asks what's wrong, he hesitates just long enough to make her pulse quicken. The truth he gives her is partial, about obligations he left behind before coming here, about choices that weren't really choices at all. He talks about loyalty and responsibility, but the way he avoids her gaze tells her there's more he's still holding back. After that night, she can't shake the sense that their time together exists on borrowed ground, and yet she keeps moving toward him, perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps out of a deep need to see where this road ends. She becomes more attuned to the moments that feel like foreshadowing, his sudden disappearances into phone calls he takes in the courtyard, the occasional slip in his tone when she asks about the future. She's never been one to fear answers, but she starts to suspect that knowing everything might cost her something she's not ready to lose. Then comes the invitation that changes the rhythm entirely. He asks her to join him at a formal event at the college, one of those nights of long tables, candlelight, and speeches that stretch on too long. She spends the day feeling uncharacteristically nervous, telling herself it's about the unfamiliarity of the setting, but deep down she knows it's because this is the first time she'll be stepping fully into his world. The night is dazzling in its way, laughter spilling over wine glasses, the hum of whispered side conversations, but beneath the beauty, she senses a tension in him, like a thread pulled too tight. At one point, she catches a look exchanged between him and another guest, a glance so brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him so closely. When she asks about it later, he dismisses it, but the dismissal is too quick, too easy. She starts to see patterns, moments when his attention seems elsewhere, when the light in his eyes dims. She remembers the confession he'd made in the village, the door left ajar, and now she can almost feel the weight of what's waiting behind it. It's during the winter break that everything begins to unravel. She stays in the city instead of returning home, partly to work on her research, partly because he's there. The streets are quieter now, the air sharp and clean. They fall into a rhythm of quiet mornings and long afternoons, but there's a fragility to it. One night, after too many glasses of wine, the edges blur and the truth begins to spill. He tells her about the life he left suspended when he came here, about the commitments that will call him back no matter what either of them wants. It's not the kind of revelation that comes with shouting or tears. It's quieter, heavier, like the slow settling of snow. The knowledge changes her. She feels herself standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down at the gap between what they have and what could survive beyond the year. And yet, instead of pulling away, she finds herself leaning closer, as if proximity can delay the inevitable. They talk less about the future now, focusing instead on the present, on days that feel like they could stretch forever if they don't name the ending that's coming. Spring arrives, and with it, a strange kind of urgency. They begin to collect moments the way some people collect souvenirs, breakfasts in tucked-away cafes, walks through gardens just beginning to bloom, conversations that wander from the ridiculous to the profound. She catches herself memorizing the way his hand feels in hers, the cadence of his laugh, the look he gives her when he thinks she's not watching. But the unspoken truth remains, and it finds its way into the spaces between them. There are nights when he seems far away even as he sits beside her, when she can see him retreating into thoughts she can't reach. She tries to convince herself it doesn't matter, that what they have now is enough, but part of her knows she's lying. The turning point comes in a way she doesn't expect. They're walking back from the library one evening when he stops suddenly, as if some internal decision has just crystallized. He tells her he has to make arrangements for when he leaves, that he can't keep pretending the year exists in isolation from the rest of his life. The words land with the force of inevitability. She's known this was coming, but knowing doesn't make it hurt less. They spend their final weeks in a space that's almost suspended outside of time. There's a tenderness to everything now, but also a sharpness, a heightened awareness that each moment could be the last of its kind. On their final night together, they walk along the river again. The fog is lighter this time, the lamps casting their halos on the water. They don't talk much, the words would only get in the way. When the morning comes, she watches him go. There's no grand goodbye, no cinematic declaration, just the quiet sound of footsteps fading away and the knowledge that this chapter has closed. She's left standing in the place where it all began, suitcase in hand once again, but she's not the same person who arrived here months ago. The year has rewritten her in ways she couldn't have planned, in ways she doesn't yet fully understand. And as she turns to face the rest of her life, she carries with her not just the memory of what they had, but the lessons buried inside it, the way love can thrive in the spaces between certainty and doubt, the way endings can be both a loss and a beginning. She was the kind of protagonist who seemed, at first glance, perfectly aligned with the narrative arc she was stepping into, bright, determined, eager to extract every drop of meaning from the opportunity before her. Yet the longer you watched her, the more you saw that her surface confidence was something constructed, a careful armor shaped over years of knowing exactly what was expected of her and how to meet those expectations. Her arrival in this new city was not just a geographical relocation, it was an emotional displacement, an unmooring from the familiar. She carried with her a certain intellectual precision, the sort of mind that dissects arguments and reassembles them, that can identify the weakest point in a claim and press on it until it gives way. But that clarity was also a kind of shield, one that kept her from exposing the more fragile, uncertain parts of herself. She wanted to belong here, not in the shallow way of seeking validation, but in the deeper sense of feeling herself knit into the fabric of a place, of having her presence matter to it. This desire was the quiet undercurrent of every interaction, whether in the seminar room, in the library, or walking through the streets that still felt like they belonged more to history than to her. Her connection to him began almost as an intellectual curiosity. He had a presence that disrupted the pattern of her days, not in grand gestures, but in the subtle way he occupied space, as if the world bent slightly around him. His intelligence wasn't the sharp, deliberate kind she wielded. It was quieter, more intuitive, like someone who understood people through instinct rather than theory. That difference unsettled her at first. It meant she couldn't quite predict him, but it also drew her in. In conversation, he had a way of asking questions that lingered long after the moment had passed. They weren't always direct. Sometimes they were half-statements, nudging her to consider her own assumptions. It was this combination of mystery and attentiveness that made him so difficult to place neatly in her mind. There were times when he seemed utterly present, as if the rest of the world had fallen away, and others when she could feel him receding into thoughts she wasn't invited into. She didn't yet realize that those moments of withdrawal were not absences, but a sign of how many worlds he was straddling at once. Their dynamic was built on contrasts. Where she sought precision, he thrived in ambiguity. Where she needed to name a thing to make it real, he was content to let it remain unspoken. And yet, they met in the middle, in shared laughter over small absurdities, in the warmth of unhurried mornings, in the simple act of walking side by side without the need to fill the air with words. But the real heart of their relationship was in what they brought out in each other. He loosened the grip she kept on her own narrative, teaching her that some chapters don't need to be written in advance. She, in turn, reminded him of the beauty in naming things, in anchoring feelings to words before they could drift away. They didn't always agree. In fact, some of their most formative moments came from disagreement, from the friction that revealed the hidden corners of who they were. Her growth over the course of the year was not loud or dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens incrementally, so that you only see it clearly in hindsight. She became less afraid of uncertainty, more willing to stand in the middle of a question without rushing to answer it. This didn't mean she abandoned her structure entirely. Rather, she learned to let it breathe. She began to understand that not every ending needed to be a conclusion, that some things could remain unresolved without losing their meaning. For him, the transformation was subtler, but no less profound. He entered their connection carrying the weight of obligations he didn't entirely name, pieces of his life that existed beyond the borders of their shared world. His initial instinct had been to keep those parts separate, to give her the best of himself while shielding her from the more complicated truths. But as they moved through the year together, he found himself letting her closer, not just into the light but into the shadows as well. This was not easy for him. There were moments when he hesitated, when the act of sharing felt like tearing open a seam he'd worked hard to keep stitched. Yet her presence had a way of making silence feel heavier than confession. He was in many ways a man of dualities. To some, he appeared rooted, steady, dependable, someone who could be counted on. To her, he was also in motion, caught between what was and what might be, between the life he'd built before and the one that tempted him now. His contradictions were not flaws but truths, and she came to understand that part of loving him was accepting that some of those truths would never fully reconcile. Their friends noticed the changes, too, though not always in ways they could articulate. Those who'd known her before remarked on her loosened edges, on the way she seemed more willing to linger in conversations that had no clear point. Those who'd known him longer saw a softening in him, a willingness to share space rather than simply occupy it. These shifts were small enough to pass unremarked upon by strangers, but for the two of them, they marked the quiet evolution of who they were becoming. What made their bond so compelling was its refusal to settle into something easily defined. They were not the kind of couple who clung to each other out of fear. Rather, they held each other lightly, knowing that the weight of the year itself would eventually pry their hands apart. This knowledge didn't lessen their closeness, it deepened it. Every shared glance, every inside joke, every argument they worked through was imbued with the awareness that their time was finite. It gave their connection an urgency that was never desperate but always deliberate. The final weeks revealed the fullness of what they had built together. She had learned to see beyond her own perspective, to understand the shape of his silences, the meaning in his pauses. He had learned to let someone in far enough to see the contradictions and love him anyway. Their story was never about a perfect alignment of paths. It was about two people meeting at a crossroads, knowing they would not walk the same road forever, but choosing to share the stretch they had. In the end, their character arcs didn't resolve neatly, just as real lives rarely do. She left with a greater capacity for ambiguity, carrying the memory of his steadiness alongside the knowledge of his limits. He left knowing that vulnerability, though it came with risk, also offered a kind of freedom he hadn't expected. They didn't change each other entirely, but they altered the terrain of each other's inner landscapes in ways that would echo long after the year was over. And perhaps that is the truest measure of their characters, not in the choices they made to hold on or to let go, but in the way they emerged from their shared time with more courage to face the parts of themselves they'd once kept hidden. They were, each in their own way, unfinished, and that was the point. Some films, even before their official release, seem to carry with them an aura of the uncanny, whispers that cling to them, little pieces of information that don't make it into press junkets or glossy interviews, but instead ripple quietly beneath the surface, carried between crew members and actors in late-night conversations. This was one of those productions. On the outside, it unfolded like many polished romantic dramas, a carefully planned shoot, a promising cast, a picturesque setting designed to make every frame feel like a page from a storybook. But under the glossy surface, there were peculiarities, accidents, and moments of serendipity that stitched themselves into the fabric of the film in ways even the director couldn't have planned. One of the most striking oddities was the timeline. The production schedule, initially plotted to run with meticulous academic precision, ended up mirroring the plot's own sense of shifting seasons and compressed time. A freak weather pattern swept across the filming location midway through the shoot, reshuffling weeks of carefully arranged outdoor sequences. Instead of ruining the momentum, it forced the team to lean into an unpredictable rhythm, and strangely, this mirrored the emotional cadence of the story itself. It's almost as if the weather became a silent co-writer, layering the visuals with a mood the original storyboards hadn't dared to imagine. When you watch certain pivotal moments, the sky heavy with unplanned clouds, or the wind cutting through a quiet scene, you're seeing nature adding her own punctuation to the script. The location itself had its share of uncanny details. The primary academic setting, so essential to the protagonist's arc, was filmed at a blend of actual historic sites and carefully dressed spaces that existed nowhere near the famous institution the plot draws inspiration from. But in a twist that gave the crew a collective shiver, some of the most resonant shots were captured in corners of the campus that were, according to local lore, off-limits after dark. A security guard told one of the assistant directors about a series of unexplained incidents, doors found open after being locked, lights flickering in rooms with no electricity running to them, the faint sound of piano music drifting down a hallway long after the last student had gone. No one on the crew claimed to see anything directly, but a few admitted off the record that those late-night shoots carried a charged energy. One camera operator swore the playback of a certain take included a faint whisper, though when they played it back a second time, it had vanished. There's also the curious case of the book that appeared in multiple scenes. It wasn't in the original prop list. It simply showed up one morning in the hands of an extra who'd brought it from their own collection to read between takes. The director noticed it and decided it belonged in the frame, first as a background detail in a library scene, then in the protagonist's dorm room, then briefly in the hands of the male lead. No one could quite articulate why it fit, but it became an accidental visual motif. Only much later did someone point out that the title, obscure and out of print, dealt with themes of fate and circular narratives, eerily close to the underlying mechanics of the story. Wardrobe, too, had its share of unplanned significance. The costume designer had sourced much of the protagonist's clothing from vintage shops, both for budgetary reasons, and to give her style an eclectic, lived-in authenticity. But it wasn't until halfway through the shoot that they realized one particular coat, worn in several key transitional scenes, had a faint, embroidered monogram on the inside lining. The initials didn't belong to any cast or crew member, but matched the name of a historical figure tied loosely to the real-life setting's literary past. The designer didn't tell the actress until after shooting wrapped, worried that it might distract her, but it became one of those uncanny little facts that gave the finished film an added air of mystery. One of the more light-hearted behind-the-scenes stories came from the catering team, of all places. The lead actors, both self-confessed food lovers, had a running challenge to see who could convince the kitchen staff to create the most elaborate snack during breaks. What began as a playful competition turned into a sort of unofficial subplot of the production, with the culinary team escalating their creations: miniature pastries shaped like iconic local landmarks, sandwiches with literary quotes etched in sauce across the plate. The mood on set lifted during those tense shooting days because of these little culinary battles, and if you look closely, a few of the treats actually appear as background items in cafe scenes. Then there was the weathered bench. In one of the most emotionally charged moments, the characters sit on a bench overlooking a wide expanse of water. That bench wasn't a prop, it had been there for decades, though no one seemed to know exactly when it had been placed. Local residents told conflicting stories. Some claimed it had been built in memory of a student who'd once studied in the area. Others said it was older than that, a leftover from when the land was privately owned. Its age gave it a patina that perfectly matched the tone of the scene, and the director, enamored with the way it seemed to hold its own quiet history, made sure to film it from multiple angles. Later, when promotional stills were released, fans of the location began sending in photos of themselves on the same bench, years before the film was made, creating an unexpected real-world connection between the story and its audience. Lighting played its own games with the production. In one scene, meant to take place in the gentle gold of a late afternoon, a sudden shift in the atmosphere caused the sunlight to flare across the lens, scattering the image with warm halos. The cinematographer, instead of adjusting to fix it, embraced the imperfection. The result is a visual moment that feels almost supernatural, as if the environment itself were responding to the emotional weight of the conversation unfolding in that instant. It became one of the most shared stills from the film online, with viewers describing it as magic without knowing the truth, that it was a lucky accident, impossible to replicate even if they'd tried. Some of the strangest occurrences were more personal, whispered between cast members in green rooms and during location changes. The lead actress admitted in an interview, months after release, that she'd had recurring dreams during the shoot, dreams in which the story played out differently. She would wake up unsettled, scribbling notes in a bedside notebook about these alternate versions, some of which uncannily resembled early drafts of the script she'd never actually read. The director, when told about this, simply smiled and said, "Some stories find you more than you find them." An equally strange coincidence involved the music. The composer, working from rough cuts, had been developing a leitmotif for the two leads, a gentle, almost hesitant melody that mirrored their cautious connection. When he presented it to the director, she froze for a moment before explaining that she'd been humming almost the exact sequence of notes on set during the early weeks of shooting, something she did unconsciously to calm her nerves between takes. No one could explain the overlap. The composer swore he hadn't visited the set during that time, and yet the melody had found its way into both their minds independently. Even the marketing team got their share of the uncanny. In designing early posters, one artist mocked up an image using a still from the waterfront scene, unknowingly placing it alongside a historic photograph in a layout test. The juxtaposition revealed that the real-life shoreline, decades earlier, had looked eerily similar, down to the pattern of clouds overhead and the positioning of a lone bird in flight. It was pure coincidence, but it lent the promotional materials a sense of timelessness that aligned beautifully with the film's themes. These facts, quirks, and small coincidences may not change the core of the story, but they form an invisible web that ties the production to something larger than itself. They remind us that filmmaking, no matter how planned or controlled, is always subject to forces beyond human orchestration. Weather, chance, the peculiar synchronicities that occur when a group of people come together to create something with intention. The strangest facts aren't always about ghosts or curses. Sometimes they're about the quiet ways reality bends to meet fiction halfway, and perhaps that's why these stories linger. Because when you watch the finished film, knowing these fragments, you can't help but see the edges differently. A scene becomes more than a scene when you know the bench is older than anyone there, when you realize the light was an unplanned gift, when you remember that a prop book wandered onto set by accident but carried the story's heartbeat inside its pages. These details turn the film from a product into a living memory, a collaboration not only between cast and crew, but between the planned and the unexpected, between human hands and the strange, uninvited magic that sometimes slips in when no one is looking. There's a curious weight that settles into a story when you begin to peel back its most defining events, not simply to recount them, but to interrogate them, to hold them up to the light as you would a fragment of stained glass, and see how each shade refracts against your own mind. This film, on the surface, may present itself as an intimate narrative of romance, self-discovery, and the slow reshaping of personal priorities, but the deeper you look, the more you realize that its pivotal moments aren't isolated beats in a plot. They're pulses in an emotional anatomy that the viewer instinctively recognizes. They breathe in time with our own regrets, our own decisions, our own half-remembered crossroads. One of the earliest major events that demands a closer look is the protagonist's arrival in this new, foreign environment. On paper, it's a standard inciting incident. A character leaves behind the familiar and steps into a world brimming with possibilities. But viewed critically, the sequence does more than move the story forward. It reframes the entire concept of arrival as both a physical act and an existential shift. The streets she walks down are not merely a setting, they're corridors of choice. Every stone path, every historical facade reminds her, and us, that stepping into a new chapter is not simply about geography. It's about carrying the burden of the self into unfamiliar air and waiting to see what changes and what stubbornly refuses to. That duality of reinvention and unshakable identity echoes throughout the rest of the film. This is why the first significant conversation between the leads, often remembered by viewers as charming or subtly flirtatious, works on another, quieter level. The dialogue is deceptively casual, but its rhythm mirrors the way strangers probe at each other's edges, looking for points of resonance. The camera lingers not on the words, but on the pauses, the beats where they study each other, gauging how much of themselves they're willing to let through. In those silences is the real seduction, not of romance, but of intellectual and emotional vulnerability. When you shift your lens to the mid-story turning point, the emotional stakes begin to crystallize. This isn't just about two people finding common ground. It's about the protagonist being confronted with the uncomfortable truth that the life she had planned may no longer fit her. The catalyst for this realization is small on the surface, a missed deadline, a quiet disagreement, a moment of personal failure, but in the grammar of the film, it's seismic. The sequence is layered with imagery that underscores the internal shift, reflections in glass that distort her face, shots framed so that she appears out of focus against her surroundings. Even the way sound is used to make the chatter of the world fade, while her breathing becomes more pronounced. These are deliberate cinematic choices, pulling us into her headspace without overt exposition. The film's emotional architecture pivots again when a revelation about the male lead surfaces, not the sort of dramatic bombshell that would belong in a thriller, but the kind of deeply human truth that quietly redefines every interaction that came before it. It's in this moment that the audience realizes the narrative isn't interested in idealized romance. It's interested in the messiness of connection. Love here is not a neat arc. It's a patchwork of unguarded moments, difficult conversations, and the constant negotiation of where one life ends and another begins. From a critical standpoint, this is where the film begins engaging in a kind of dialogue with the audience. We're no longer passive recipients of a story. We're invited to weigh our own experiences against the choices on screen. The ethical questions begin to rise. What does it mean to pursue a relationship when time, distance, and personal ambitions pull in opposite directions? Can two people truly meet each other where they are without sacrificing something essential? The film doesn't hand out answers. It lingers in the ambiguity, which is precisely why it resonates. The climactic sequence, often remembered for its sheer emotional intensity, is a perfect example of how an event can be both inevitable and devastating. The director builds it with patience, weaving together earlier narrative threads so that, when the moment arrives, it feels less like a plot twist and more like a truth the characters and the audience have been slowly circling from the start. Here, the use of space becomes critical. The characters are physically close, but the frame is filled with barriers, doorways, furniture, the slight tilt of the camera that suggests imbalance. The emotional geography mirrors the literal one. They can reach for each other, but the path is obstructed. What's remarkable about this climax is how it refuses the neatness of resolution. Yes, decisions are made, and consequences set in motion, but the emotional residue lingers. It's a refusal to pretend that hard choices don't leave scars. In this way, the film's structure mirrors lived experience. Closure is rare, and even when we move forward, we carry the weight of what was left behind. From the perspective of thematic resonance, these significant events stitch together a portrait of impermanence. The protagonist's journey is less about finding the right outcome and more about learning to inhabit the in-between spaces, those moments where life doesn't quite match the vision you had for it, but offers something different, maybe even richer, in its place. The missed opportunities are as formative as the seized ones. The relationships that don't survive still leave imprints that shape who we become. This is why the film has such a lasting impact on viewers who come to it with a literary mindset. It's not the spectacle of the events themselves. It's the way they echo long after the credits roll. The missed train that forces her to walk home alone becomes a metaphor for the detours we never planned but end up defining us. The rainstorm that interrupts a pivotal confession becomes a symbol of how life's interruptions can shift the meaning of a moment entirely. The letter left unread on a desk becomes the embodiment of words we never managed to say, and the quiet devastation of knowing they might have changed everything. Critically, it's worth noting how these events were received differently by various audiences. Some viewers found the unresolved nature of the ending frustrating, wishing for a more definitive outcome. Others praised it as the film's greatest strength, a refusal to compromise its emotional authenticity for the sake of tidiness. That division in reception is, in itself, a testament to the story's power. It refuses to be universally agreed upon, insisting instead that each viewer wrestle with it in their own way. Even the smaller beats, an exchanged glance across a crowded room, a brief touch of hands in passing, contribute to the whole. In literature, these are the equivalent of well-placed commas or the strategic use of white space. They shape the rhythm of the narrative as much as the big events do. The film understands this, giving these moments room to breathe instead of rushing through them to get to the next plot point. Ultimately, what these events reveal, when examined critically, is that the heart of the story lies in tension, not the tension of will they or won't they, but the deeper, more human tension of how we navigate our own desires when they collide with reality. The choices the characters make, the ones they avoid, and the ones made for them all contribute to a layered meditation on love, ambition, and the quiet tragedies of timing. And perhaps that is why, long after the final scene fades, you find yourself replaying certain moments in your mind, not because you're searching for a different outcome, but because you recognize something of your own life there. The film's events, when filtered through a critical lens, aren't just story beats. They're mirrors reflecting back the complex, often contradictory ways we experience connection, loss, and the endless negotiation between who we are and who we want to be. What's fascinating about pulling back the curtain on a film like this is realizing how much of its heartbeat lives outside the scenes we see on screen. It's easy to imagine that the magic happens entirely in front of the camera, in those carefully framed moments where actors inhabit their roles so convincingly that we forget they're working from a script. But the truth is, the real alchemy often happens in the margins, in the months before shooting begins, in the quiet exchanges between director and cinematographer, in the accidental discoveries that occur because of a missed cue or a sudden change in weather. This film is a perfect example of how the process of making a movie can be as layered, unpredictable, and emotionally charged as the story it tells. The earliest stages of its creation began not with casting or costume design, but with an almost obsessive focus on tone. The director had a very specific vision for the film's emotional rhythm, one that was as much about restraint as it was about expression. In interviews, they spoke about wanting every frame to feel lived in, as though we were peeking into moments that had been unfolding long before the camera arrived and would continue after it left. That vision influenced every choice that followed, from how sets were lit to how the script was paced, even down to the types of shoes characters wore to alter the way they walked and carried themselves. Pre-production meetings were less about rigidly locking in every detail and more about creating a shared vocabulary among the creative team. The cinematographer recalled long discussions not about specific shots, but about feelings, what kind of longing should fill the air during a particular scene, how isolation should be communicated without ever showing the character alone. Those conversations often led to visual experiments, like shooting through partially frosted glass or placing objects in the extreme foreground to create the sensation of eavesdropping. One of the more charming behind-the-scenes stories came from the costume department. Because the film's setting straddled the line between the immediate present and a kind of timeless academic backdrop, the designer had to find a wardrobe that felt both contemporary and quietly steeped in tradition. They scoured vintage shops and estate sales for pieces that looked like they might have belonged to someone's grandmother, then paired them with modern tailoring so the characters could feel like real people living in a layered world rather than archetypes pulled from a catalog. There's an anecdote about one scarf in particular, an unassuming bit of fabric in a muted shade that ended up becoming a subtle visual motif throughout the film. It wasn't planned that way. An actor simply liked it, kept wearing it between takes, and eventually the director decided it should recur as a symbol of comfort and continuity. The actual shoot was a study in controlled chaos. The film relied heavily on natural light, which meant the production schedule was at the mercy of the weather. On more than one occasion, entire scenes had to be rearranged because the cloud cover wasn't cooperating, or a sudden burst of sunshine would throw off the carefully planned visual palette. Rather than see these as obstacles, the director embraced them, allowing the changing light to shape the emotional texture of the film. There's one scene where the soft dimming of daylight adds a melancholic undertone to an otherwise hopeful exchange, and it was purely the result of a passing storm. Another unexpected challenge came from shooting in real working locations rather than constructed sets. The ambient sounds, the hum of distant traffic, the chatter of students walking past, the creak of old wooden floors were initially seen as distractions, but quickly became part of the film's atmosphere. The sound team made the deliberate choice to keep many of these imperfections, using them to root the story in a tactile, breathing environment. In one instance, a gust of wind blew through an open window during a pivotal conversation, causing papers to scatter across the room. Instead of cutting, the actors stayed in character, incorporating the moment into their performance. That take ended up in the final cut, and it's one of the most human touches in the entire film. The camaraderie among the cast and crew also played a huge role in shaping the energy on set. This was not one of those productions where actors disappeared into their trailers between scenes. Instead, they stayed close, often running lines together or sharing meals in the same communal spaces. One of the supporting actors even organized weekend outings to explore the local area, which helped the ensemble build a shared sense of place that translated beautifully to the screen. Those bonds were especially important for scenes that required deep vulnerability. There was an underlying trust that allowed the actors to take emotional risks without fear of overstepping. From a technical perspective, the film's editing process was almost as intricate as its shoot. The editor described the footage as fragile, not in the sense that it was difficult to work with, but in the way that each moment seemed delicately balanced, as if removing even a single frame could alter the emotional trajectory of a scene. The pacing was meticulously fine-tuned, sometimes by holding a reaction shot a fraction of a second longer than instinct would suggest, allowing the audience to sink into the character's unspoken thoughts. One particularly interesting production decision involved the score. Early in development, the team considered leaning heavily on music to underscore emotional beats, but they ultimately opted for a far sparser approach. Instead of a constant melodic presence, the score slips in only at select moments, often fading in so subtly you don't notice it until it's already begun to shift the mood. In many scenes, the absence of music is what makes the moment resonate. The sounds of footsteps on stone, the scrape of a chair, the murmur of distant voices become the score instead. Of course, no production is without its near disasters. There was one day where a key scene risked being scrapped entirely due to a location double booking. The crew arrived to find the space unexpectedly occupied by a large, noisy event. In a scramble to adjust, the director and location manager found a nearby room that had never been considered, a slightly smaller, dimly lit space with uneven walls and an old fireplace. What could have been a setback ended up adding an intimacy and texture that the original location lacked. The improvised choice became one of the film's most memorable sequences. Another fun piece of trivia. One of the film's most poetic visual moments, where a character watches dust motes drift through a beam of sunlight, was completely unplanned. The cinematographer spotted the light filtering through a high window during a break, quickly called the actor over, and rolled the camera without even announcing action. The result was a quiet, almost meditative shot that fit seamlessly into the finished film, a perfect example of how serendipity can be a filmmaker's best collaborator. Even in post-production, the collaborative spirit remained strong. The director invited not just the producers, but also the heads of departments, costume, sound, set design, to early screenings of the rough cut. They believed that the people who had lived inside the world of the film during production could spot nuances that might be lost in the edit. This democratic approach led to subtle but impactful changes, like shifting the placement of a particular scene to better preserve the emotional throughline. Looking back, what's perhaps most striking about the making of this film is how many of its defining features came from embracing unpredictability. The guiding vision was strong, yes, but it was never so rigid that it couldn't bend in response to what the moment offered. In that way, the filmmaking process mirrored the story itself, a journey shaped as much by what was planned as by what was discovered along the way. And maybe that's why, when you watch the finished piece, it feels so alive, not because every detail was meticulously engineered, but because it breathes with the imperfections, accidents, and flashes of inspiration that no one could have written into the script. There's something intoxicating about the way this film moves through its world, as if the setting itself were another character, one that doesn't speak in words, but in textures, colors, and the quiet hum of lived history. Long before the audience connects with the characters, they connect with the environment. It seeps into them like a slow-brewed tea, rich and subtle, until it's hard to tell where the people end and the place begins. The first thing you notice is the light. This is not the harsh, evenly lit world of standard studio fare, but a light that feels as though it's been filtered through memory. It bends, softens, and sometimes fractures into shards, creating a kind of emotional weather. The mornings are bathed in a pale gold that makes the air feel cooler than it is, as though the day is holding its breath. By late afternoon, the light deepens into warm honey tones, lengthening shadows and turning even the simplest objects, a teacup, a window pane, into small altars of attention. The director and cinematographer clearly understood that light is not just illumination, it's a form of storytelling. It can lull, it can unsettle, it can make you feel at home or remind you that you're somewhere you don't belong. Then there are the spaces themselves. The story unfolds in a place that straddles two worlds, the immediacy of the present and the gravity of a setting that feels steeped in tradition. Narrow streets wind like half-forgotten thoughts, flanked by buildings whose stones have seen generations pass. Interiors are intimate but not cramped, carrying the scent of old wood and dust that's settled over centuries. You can almost hear the whispers trapped in those walls, conversations from decades ago, laughter, tears, the scratch of a pen on parchment. These aren't just backdrops, they're emotional landscapes that carry the weight of everything that's happened there before the story even begins. One of the film's most impressive achievements is its refusal to romanticize these spaces in a predictable way. Yes, they're beautiful, but not in the glossy, brochure-perfect sense. The beauty here comes from imperfection. Uneven cobblestones that threaten to trip you if you're not paying attention, window frames with peeling paint, ivy that's grown wild and threatens to choke out the brick beneath it. These flaws make the place feel alive, resisting the static perfection of a set designed solely to be looked at. It's as though the world on-screen is constantly reminding the viewer that life is always in motion, always changing, even in the most ancient and seemingly permanent of places. The sound design extends the reach of the setting, grounding the viewer even further. You hear the faint echo of footsteps in hallways, the distant toll of a bell, the way rain taps differently against glass than it does against slate. Every sound feels like it belongs exactly where it is, unintrusive but impossible to ignore if you're listening closely. The filmmakers resisted the urge to strip the audio down to a pristine quiet, instead embracing the messiness of real spaces. You can sense that these are places people actually inhabit, not sterile sets dressed for the day. Cinematography plays an equally crucial role in shaping the audience's emotional relationship with the setting. The camera doesn't just capture the environment, it moves through it with intention. There are moments when it glides slowly, almost reverently, allowing the viewer to drink in every detail, and others when it pushes forward with urgency, following characters as they navigate tight corridors or spill into open courtyards. The lens choices are deliberate, often shifting from wide shots that give you the full sweep of a room to tight, intimate close-ups that place you directly in a character's personal space. This oscillation between scope and intimacy mirrors the way we experience real places, sometimes as observers, sometimes as participants. Color is wielded with the precision of a novelist choosing the perfect word. Early scenes favor a muted palette, earth tones, soft blues, the worn beige of aged paper, creating a grounded, almost subdued emotional base. As the story progresses and tensions rise, small bursts of more saturated color begin to creep in. A vivid red scarf draped over a chair, a sudden flush of orange light spilling from a doorway at night. These shifts are subtle enough that you might not notice them consciously, but they register on an emotional level, guiding your mood in ways you can't quite name. Weather is another silent storyteller. The filmmakers use it not as a backdrop, but as an active participant in the narrative. Overcast skies press down on the characters during moments of doubt, while sudden shafts of sunlight break through just when hope seems most fragile. Rain is particularly effective, sometimes soft and mist-like, sometimes a heavy, relentless downpour that blurs the edges of the frame. It's more than atmospheric dressing. It's an externalization of the inner emotional states of the people we're watching. The interplay between interior and exterior spaces deepens the thematic resonance. Interiors are often shot with a certain stillness, a containment that reflects the rules and expectations pressing down on the characters. The outside world, by contrast, is fluid and unpredictable. Wind tousles hair, leaves scatter across paths, voices carry farther than they should. Characters are constantly moving between these realms, and the transitions are rarely neutral. Stepping outside might feel like liberation or exposure, while returning indoors might feel like safety or suffocation, depending on the moment. One of the most striking uses of setting comes in moments where the environment seems to mirror the narrative without becoming overtly symbolic. A corridor narrowing just as a conversation turns confrontational. A sudden gust slamming a door shut at the precise moment, a character makes an irreversible choice. These instances are not staged in a way that calls attention to themselves. They're woven into the texture of the world so naturally that they feel like the hand of fate, invisible yet undeniable. Even the props and set dressings are chosen with an almost literary attention to detail. Desks are cluttered with handwritten notes, half-empty teacups, and books left open mid-sentence, suggesting that life here is always in progress, never neatly wrapped up. Hallways display photographs in mismatched frames, each one hinting at a story the film never tells outright. These small touches invite the viewer to imagine a world beyond the edges of the frame, to believe that if the camera turned in another direction, there would be just as much life unfolding there too. The rhythm of the editing honors the atmosphere the setting creates. Long takes are allowed to breathe, giving the audience time to absorb the environment, while quicker cuts are reserved for moments where the emotional temperature spikes. The filmmakers understand that pacing isn't just about moving the story forward, it's about giving the world enough space to leave its imprint on the viewer. By the time the film reaches its final act, the setting has done something remarkable. It has shaped the way we understand the characters without ever stating its influence outright. The world they inhabit has softened some edges, sharpened others, and forced them into choices they might not have made elsewhere. In this way, the setting is both stage and catalyst, a quiet but powerful force that ensures the story could not have taken place anywhere else without becoming something entirely different. And perhaps that's the most lasting achievement of the film's visual and spatial design. It convinces us that this place is real, that we could step into it and find it waiting for us exactly as we saw it. It's not just a location. It's an experience, one that lingers in the mind long after the credits roll, like a dream you can still smell and feel even after waking. What's fascinating about this film is that even though it unfolds with such polished grace on-screen, the journey to bring it there was anything but effortless. Behind the quiet elegance of the final product was a living, breathing machine of human effort, filled with last-minute adjustments, bursts of creativity, unpredictable challenges, and moments that, while invisible to the audience, shaped everything about the tone and rhythm of the story. The director had a reputation for being deeply precise, but also deeply collaborative, a rare combination that turned the set into a kind of creative workshop. Every morning began with a ritual. Coffee brewing in mismatched mugs at the craft table, crew members drifting in from the cold with scarves wrapped up to their chins, actors arriving with scripts tucked under their arms, some still marked with handwritten notes from late-night study. Conversations would start soft, as if everyone were slowly re-entering the world they were building together, and then crescendo into bursts of laughter or heated but friendly debates about whether a scene's emotional pitch should tilt toward hope or restraint. One of the most surprising stories from production came from a scene that, in the final cut, lasts less than a minute, a brief moment of a character standing alone, bathed in fractured light from a stained glass window. It looks effortless on-screen, but it was the result of an entire day's work, because the crew couldn't quite get the natural light to fall exactly as the director imagined. Instead of resorting to digital trickery, they experimented with angling mirrors outside the window, shifting the position of reflectors by mere inches, even timing the shot to a very specific moment in the afternoon when the sun would thread through a gap in the clouds. By the time the director called action, the set was silent, almost reverent, and the actor delivered a wordless expression so perfectly matched to the light that no one dared move for several seconds after cut was called. The cast dynamics were another quiet marvel. While the script demanded moments of intense emotional tension, off-camera the relationships between the leads were warm and full of gentle teasing. Between takes they'd share snacks, huddle over phones showing each other photographs from home, or swap stories about the last project they'd worked on. This camaraderie gave the performances an undercurrent of trust. You can sense that even in scenes where characters are at odds, the actors are holding each other up. That trust is something that can't be faked. It either exists or it doesn't, and in this case it thrived. Filming on location brought its own share of unpredictable challenges. One key outdoor sequence had been meticulously storyboarded, only for the weather to decide otherwise. The day was meant to be crisp and sunny, but clouds rolled in thick and heavy, carrying a threat of rain that could ruin the continuity between shots. Instead of panicking, the cinematographer embraced the change, reframing the sequence to lean into the moody, overcast look. Ironically, this unplanned shift gave the scene a weight and intimacy it wouldn't have had otherwise, proof that sometimes the best artistic choices are born of limitation. There was also the infamous prop switch incident. A critical scene required an old, weathered journal, but the original prop had been misplaced sometime between takes. With shooting already behind schedule, the props department scrambled to find a replacement. They ended up aging a brand new notebook by hand in less than an hour, staining its pages with tea, scuffing the leather cover with sandpaper, and even tearing the binding in places to give it the feel of something carried for decades. The director later admitted that the last-minute journal looked more authentic than the one they'd planned to use all along, and it stayed in the film. Not every challenge was solved so serendipitously. The production schedule was tight, and the story's emotional beats required the actors to arrive on set already deep in their characters' internal lives. There were days when exhaustion threatened to dull the edges of the performances, and it became part of the director's job to find small ways to re-energize the cast. Sometimes that meant clearing the set for a few minutes so an actor could reset in quiet. Other times it meant inviting a little chaos, a spontaneous improv exercise, an off-script exchange, even an impromptu dance between takes, to shake loose whatever was holding the performance back. One of the most quietly inspiring aspects of the behind-the-scenes process was the crew's shared commitment to storytelling over ego. department heads would wander into each other's spaces to troubleshoot problems without worrying about whose jurisdiction it was. The costume designer might weigh in on how a certain camera angle caught the movement of a skirt, or the lighting crew might suggest a prop that would catch a glint just right. The goal was always the same: to serve the scene. It made for a set that felt less like a hierarchy and more like a circle, where everyone's voice mattered. There were also moments of pure human absurdity that will never make it into any behind-the-scenes documentary. Like the time a scene was interrupted by an enthusiastic neighborhood cat that wandered onto set, meowing loudly during a pivotal monologue, or when a carefully lit interior was thrown into chaos because someone accidentally leaned on a dimmer switch, plunging half the room into shadow mid-take. Instead of frustration, these interruptions often dissolved into laughter, a reminder that even in the most carefully controlled environment, life has its own ideas. Some of the most emotionally charged scenes were filmed in near silence, not just because of the sound recording, but because the cast and crew instinctively recognized the fragility of the moment. There's a particular kind of quiet that happens when everyone knows something special is happening. It's not tension, but a collective holding of breath. One crew member described it as standing in a bubble you don't want to pop. That respect for the moment carried through to the final product. You can feel it in the stillness of certain shots, in the way the camera seems to lean in but never intrude. By the end of production, the set had become something more than just a workplace. Friendships had formed, creative partnerships had deepened, and everyone had a sense of shared ownership over the story. On the final day after the last scene wrapped, there was no formal celebration, just a long, lingering evening where cast and crew stayed behind, packing up slowly, reluctant to step away from the world they had built together. Some took photographs of the set before it was dismantled, as if trying to capture not just the physical space, but the feeling of having been part of something ephemeral and rare. It's easy to watch a finished film and imagine that it arrived whole, fully formed, as if it had always existed. But the truth is that every frame carries the fingerprints of the people who made it, the problem solvers, the risk takers, the quiet contributors who never appear on screen, but whose work shapes every moment. And in this case, those fingerprints are all over the film, hidden in the light on a character's face, in the way a jacket falls over a chair, in the rhythm of a scene that feels unforced because it was forged in trust. What's left after all the props are returned and the lights are packed away is the memory of those days, the shared coffee in the cold morning air, the long hours spent chasing the perfect shot, the small victories when a stubborn detail finally clicks into place. Those are the moments the audience will never see, but they're the ones that make the magic possible. And maybe, in some quiet way, that's the real story, the one that lives just beneath the surface of the one we all came to watch. There's a curious thing about stories like this one. They're built not only on the events we see, but on the invisible architecture of ideas holding them together. You can watch it purely for the surface, taking in the dialogue, the glances, the plot twists, and you'll walk away with a coherent experience. But underneath, woven into the film's fabric, are themes and symbols that work quietly, like threads dyed in subtle shades, pulling at the emotional responses we might not even consciously register. They're the elements that make you feel something without quite knowing why: an ache, a lift, a pang of recognition, and they linger long after the credits roll. One of the most immediate themes is transformation through displacement. The story's arc is set in motion by a shift in place and circumstance, uprooting characters from the familiar into a world that is both exhilarating and uncertain. On the surface, it's a narrative device, move the protagonist somewhere new to spark conflict and discovery, but symbolically, it becomes an exploration of how identity is reshaped when the ground beneath us changes. Settings are not just backdrops here, they act as mirrors, refracting different versions of the self. A quiet library scene, for example, isn't merely about a character reading, it's about the solitude of learning to belong in a world where the rules feel unspoken and ancient. Time, too, is an ever-present undercurrent, not in the ticking clock sense of a thriller, but as a more intimate awareness of moments slipping by. The camera is lingering on certain shots, a hand trailing along a wooden banister, sunlight moving across the floorboards, invites us to think about how experiences are built from small, transient details. Time becomes both the backdrop and the antagonist, quietly reminding us that connections, opportunities, and even grief are bound to it. In a way, time here is portrayed less as something to fight against and more as something to notice, to surrender to. Another thread winding through the story is the tension between duty and desire. Characters are continually caught between the paths they think they should take and the ones they want to take. This tension is amplified by the symbolic use of thresholds, doorways, bridges, even narrow corridors, that visually suggest the in-between spaces where decisions are made. You start to notice that the most emotionally charged conversations often happen in these liminal zones, as though the environment itself is acknowledging that the characters are suspended between two states of being. The symbolism extends into recurring objects. A particular book, weathered and annotated, passes between hands over the course of the film. At first, it's a practical prop, a tool for a character's research. But as the story unfolds, it comes to stand for something far deeper. The exchange of knowledge, the layering of perspectives, the idea that every person adds their own mark to the narratives they inherit. Even the way the book is shot, close-ups on frayed corners, pages turned with deliberate care, reinforces its role as a vessel of continuity in a world of constant change. Light and shadow play their own symbolic game, almost as characters in their own right. Interiors are often bathed in soft, natural light, but there's an intentional fluctuation, moments where a character steps from brightness into shadow mid-sentence, or vice versa. These transitions happen during pivotal beats, visually tracing the shifts in emotional or moral clarity. It's never heavy-handed, but once you notice it, it's impossible not to read it as a commentary on the blurred boundaries between certainty and doubt, truth and self-deception. Language, both spoken and unspoken, also emerges as a thematic layer. Dialogue is often sparse, with long pauses or half-finished thoughts leaving space for interpretation. The silences speak as loudly as the words, sometimes conveying intimacy, sometimes alienation. This is mirrored in visual motifs, windows that offer partial views, letters that arrive with key sentences smudged or missing, conversations overheard but not fully understood. These moments reinforce the theme that understanding is always incomplete, that we're constantly piecing together meaning from fragments. Love, in this story, resists the neatness of genre conventions. It's not presented as a single sweeping arc, but as a mosaic of moments, hesitations, misread signals, unguarded laughter, sudden distance. The theme here isn't just romantic love, but love as a broader human capacity. Love for a place, for an idea, for the version of ourselves we glimpse in someone else's eyes. The symbolism around this is often tied to weather, fleeting sun after rain, wind that picks up just as two characters part ways, a sudden stillness in the air during a moment of realization. These shifts in the environment seem to echo the interior climate of the relationships. Loss is another quiet but persistent current, not the shattering, cinematic kind of loss, but the smaller, more private ones that accumulate over time, opportunities not taken, friendships that fade, a sense of certainty that evaporates without notice. Here, water becomes the central symbol. Sometimes it's literal, a slow ripple across a pond, a drop of tea falling into milk, but often it's implied, in the way the sound design carries the faintest hum of rain even in dry scenes. Water's fluidity becomes a stand-in for impermanence, for the way everything we try to hold eventually shifts and moves beyond our grasp. There's also an underlying theme of doubling and reflection. Certain lines of dialogue are echoed later by different characters in altered contexts, giving them new shades of meaning. Visually, this is reinforced by mirrors, polished surfaces, and even architectural symmetry. These choices seem to invite the audience to consider how experiences are refracted, how they're transformed when filtered through another person's perspective. It's a reminder that our own narratives are never wholly our own. They're interwoven with the stories of others, reshaped every time they're retold. The film doesn't shy away from the idea that growth often requires discomfort. Characters are placed in situations where their assumptions are challenged, their strengths tested, and their vulnerabilities exposed. This is where the symbolic use of footwear becomes unexpectedly poignant: scuffed shoes, heels that don't quite fit, boots that sink slightly into wet grass. These are small details, almost invisible, but they serve as tactile reminders of the journeys being undertaken, both literal and internal. One of the most powerful symbols comes in the form of a recurring motif, an old, slightly crooked tree on the edge of a courtyard. It appears in the background of multiple scenes, sometimes in sharp focus, sometimes blurred. Early on, it's simply part of the scenery, but as the narrative unfolds, it becomes a quiet witness to the characters' transformations. The tree's gnarled branches and weathered bark speak to endurance, to the beauty of imperfection, and to the idea that growth doesn't always follow a straight line. By the end, its presence feels almost like a reassurance that change, though inevitable, can also be grounding. In connecting these themes to the plot and characters, it becomes clear that they're not layered on as afterthoughts, they're embedded in the very structure of the story. The decisions the characters make, the obstacles they face, the relationships they forge or let go of, all echo these deeper ideas. A conversation in a sunlit kitchen isn't just about making plans. It's about time and choice, and the bittersweet knowledge that nothing can stay as it is. A walk along a fog-covered path isn't just scene setting, it's a meditation on clarity and obscurity, on what we can and can't see ahead of us. By the time the story closes, the themes and symbols have worked their way under the skin, shaping the experience in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. You're left not just with the memory of what happened, but with a lingering awareness of what it meant and of the unspoken connections between the visible and the unseen. The film becomes less about the plot you can summarize and more about the texture of the world it created, the way light fell, the way words lingered, the way certain images seemed to follow you long after. And perhaps that's the most enduring symbol of all, the idea that stories, like the lives they depict, are never truly over when they end. They echo, quietly, in the spaces we carry them into next. From the very first frame, there's a sense that every choice in this film was made with a precision that goes beyond merely telling a story. It's not about showing events as they happen, it's about shaping how we, as an audience, inhabit them. Filmmaking techniques here aren't decorative flourishes, they're the architecture of the film's emotional landscape, the invisible scaffolding that guides where our eyes linger, where our attention drifts, and how our hearts respond. This is a story that could have been told plainly, but the way it's constructed, shot by shot, sound by sound, transforms it into an immersive, almost tactile experience. The camera work is perhaps the most immediately noticeable. There's a gentle restraint to it, a refusal to rush even in moments where conventional pacing might demand urgency. Long takes are used sparingly but effectively, allowing us to breathe with the characters, to notice the way a hand trembles before making contact, or the flicker of hesitation in a glance. It's the kind of cinematography that feels intimate without being intrusive, as though the camera is an unspoken confidant rather than a voyeur. When movement does come, tracking shots that follow a character through winding hallways, slow pans across a crowded room, it feels purposeful, often mirroring the emotional arc of the scene. Lighting plays a deeply symbolic role, but technically, it's also one of the film's most impressive achievements. There's a mastery in balancing natural light with subtle artificial enhancement, creating a palette that feels both organic and heightened. Interiors glow with warmth, but not in a way that tips into sentimentality. Exteriors often bathe in a kind of soft haze that blurs the edges of reality. Shadows are allowed to breathe, to take up space, which gives certain scenes a painterly quality, moments where you could freeze the frame and hang it on a wall. This careful orchestration of light and shadow also feeds directly into the themes, reinforcing the push and pull between clarity and ambiguity. Editing here is deliberate in a way that draws attention without being showy. Cuts are often timed not to dialogue beats, but to moments of internal realization, an unspoken thought registering across a face, the pause before someone decides to speak, the slight shift in body language that signals retreat or advance. In some sequences, transitions are nearly imperceptible, allowing one scene to bleed into the next through the continuation of a sound or a matching visual element. This fluidity gives the film a dreamlike quality, making it feel as though events are connected by emotional logic rather than strict chronology. It's a choice that demands more from the viewer, but it also rewards attention with a deeper sense of immersion. Sound design is equally meticulous. Ambient noise is never just background, it's a narrative tool. The distant hum of traffic in an otherwise quiet moment underscores the isolation of a character. The creak of floorboards in an old building carries as much weight as a spoken confession. There's a particular attention to the way sound is layered. Voices blend with environmental textures, and silence is wielded like an instrument in its own right. More than once, the absence of sound becomes its own statement, creating a vacuum that heightens our sensitivity to what's about to happen. The score weaves in and out of this soundscape, never dominating but always present, sometimes as a barely there piano motif, other times as a swelling orchestration that mirrors a character's rising courage or sinking despair. The framing of shots tells its own story. Characters are often placed slightly off-center, creating a subtle sense of imbalance that mirrors their emotional states. Depth of field is used with precision, sometimes drawing our focus sharply to a single detail in the foreground, other times allowing background movement to catch our eye and hint at unseen narratives. In conversation scenes, the camera occasionally lingers on the listener rather than the speaker, letting us absorb reactions that might otherwise go unnoticed. These choices add layers to the storytelling, making it as much about what's unsaid as what's spoken. One of the most striking technical flourishes is the recurring use of visual motifs that evolve over time. A corridor that first appears dim and constricting later reappears bathed in light, the same space transformed by narrative context. The repetition of certain angles or compositions creates a visual echo, reminding us of past moments and inviting comparison. This isn't just aesthetic, it's a way of embedding memory into the physical space of the film, making the setting feel alive with the ghosts of earlier scenes. The pacing, shaped by both cinematography and editing, resists the modern tendency toward rapid cuts and constant motion. There's trust here, trust that the audience will sit with a moment, will let the weight of it settle before moving on. This slower rhythm doesn't drag, rather, it amplifies the emotional resonance, allowing each beat to land fully. When faster pacing does appear, it's a jolt signaling urgency or chaos in a way that feels earned rather than manipulative. Production design also plays into the film's technical strength. Every location feels inhabited, not dressed for the camera. Books are worn, furniture bears the marks of use, and even the smallest props seem chosen for their ability to suggest a backstory. This attention to detail means that the world on screen feels cohesive and believable, which in turn allows the more heightened emotional and thematic elements to land without feeling contrived. The interplay between visual and auditory elements is where the film's technical mastery truly shines. In one particularly memorable sequence, the camera drifts slowly through a room while a single, sustained note hums in the background. The note doesn't resolve until the camera settles on a crucial object, at which point the sound fades into near silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of footsteps. It's a moment that combines cinematography, sound design, and pacing into a single, unified gesture, one that tells us as much about the story as any line of dialogue could. Even the color grading contributes to the narrative. There's a subtle shift over the course of the film. Early scenes carry a cooler, more muted tone, while later ones gradually warm, introducing richer hues as relationships deepen and stakes intensify. This shift is so gradual that it's felt more than noticed, but it leaves an impression, almost like the sensation of stepping into sunlight after being indoors. Behind all these techniques is a production that clearly understood the value of cohesion. There's a synergy between departments. The cinematographer's compositions complement the production designer's spaces, the editor's rhythms harmonize with the composer's cues, the sound team's textures enhance the director's vision. This level of alignment doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of meticulous planning and a shared commitment to the story's emotional core. On the business side, the film's box office journey is an interesting counterpoint to its artistic ambitions. It's the kind of project that wasn't designed purely for mass-market appeal. Its pacing, its thematic density, its refusal to spoon-feed the audience all but guarantee that it would find its audience more gradually. Early box office returns reflected this, with modest opening numbers that nonetheless held steady week after week. Word of mouth became the driving force, with viewers recommending it not as casual entertainment, but as an experience worth sitting with, thinking about, and discussing. Critical reception, too, played a role in sustaining its run. Reviews often singled out the very techniques that might have alienated a broader audience: its measured pace, its layered sound design, its refusal to simplify complex emotional beats, as strengths rather than weaknesses. Festival screenings helped cement its reputation, drawing in viewers who might not have encountered it otherwise. By the time it closed its theatrical run, the film had not only recouped its budget, but also established itself as a touchstone for discussions about how technical craft can serve narrative depth. In the years since its release, the film has continued to be studied for precisely these reasons. Filmmakers reference its use of framing and light. Sound designers point to its restraint as proof that quiet can be as powerful as noise. Editors admire its ability to create momentum without sacrificing intimacy. It has become the kind of work that, while perhaps never dominating box office charts, leaves a lasting mark on those who engage with it, a reminder that technique, when wielded with intention, can shape not only how a story is told, but how it is felt. By the end, you realize that what makes the film unforgettable isn't just the plot or the performances, but the sum of its parts, the way the camera moves like a thought, the way the sound lingers like an echo, the way light falls like memory itself. It's a testament to what happens when every aspect of filmmaking works in concert, each element reinforcing the others, all in service of something that transcends the screen. And that perhaps is the real box office triumph, not just in numbers, but in the way it continues to earn its place in the minds and hearts of those who have seen it, by the time the credits begin there. Slow, measured crawl, there's a sensation, not of finality, but of being released from a spell. You feel as though you've been somewhere, walked roads that didn't exist before, seen through eyes that were not your own. That's the mark of a film that doesn't just occupy 2 hours of your life, but rearranges something in you, however subtly. And as I sit here, letting the afterimage of it linger, I can't help retracing the path we've taken together in this exploration. It began with an invitation to step closer, to treat this piece of cinema not as a casual diversion, but as a text, alive, deliberate, and intricate enough to withstand our lingering gaze. From the outset, we acknowledged that this was never going to be a simple review, never about rattling off a list of pros and cons, but rather about digging beneath the surface, turning over the soil to see what grows there. And so we laid out the architecture, the introduction that set the stage for thematic dissection, the overview that situated it in its cultural and creative context, and that first brush with the narrative arc that teased rather than told, inviting curiosity. From there, we sank into the story itself. The early stretch was a slow burn, a carefully measured unveiling of characters, motivations, and the invisible strings that tied them together. We noticed the subtleties. How a look could betray more than a monologue, how the absence of an expected reaction could ripple louder than an explosion. We tracked the narrative beats not just as events, but as shifts in emotional gravity, understanding how the foundation was being laid for the turns to come. Then came the middle, the gradual tightening of the rope. This was where alliances shifted, where truths sharpened their edges, and where the characters began to reveal themselves under pressure. It's always fascinating to watch that moment in a well-constructed story when the stakes are no longer abstract. They've come to live in the smallest moments: a hand withdrawn, a word left unsaid, a door closed quietly rather than slammed. And all the while the craft was there, shaping how we felt these beats, whether we noticed it consciously or not. The latter half, of course, was where it all converged. This was the territory of choices that could not be undone, of consequences that felt inevitable and yet surprising. We experienced climaxes that were as much about emotional truths as they were about plot resolutions. Here, the threads we'd been tracing since the beginning pulled taut and wove themselves into a pattern, one we could see only by stepping back. And when the resolution came, it didn't arrive as a neat bow, but as something more resonant, the recognition that every answer carried its own set of questions, every ending its own quiet continuation. Beyond plot, we examined the people who inhabited this world. Characters were not built of archetypes but of contradictions, those wonderfully human mixtures of courage and fear, tenderness and selfishness, truth and self-deception. We saw how they grew, or failed to, how their arcs intersected and collided, leaving marks on each other that felt permanent. And in these observations, we recognized something of ourselves, because good character work doesn't hold up a mirror to flatter, it holds it up to reveal. We took detours into the margins, uncovering the strange and fascinating trivia tucked into the making of the film. Those behind-the-scenes moments, the accidents that became defining scenes, the choices that seemed small in production but enormous on screen, reminded us that cinema is as much about serendipity as it is about planning. The creative process, after all, is rarely neat. It's a living, unpredictable thing, and here we had the rare chance to glimpse its messier edges. We brought a critical lens to key events, interrogating not just what happened, but how and why it worked, or didn't. This is where film as an art form becomes truly rich, in the dialogue between creator and audience, between intention and reception. We saw how certain moments became cultural touchpoints, how thematic undercurrents resonated differently depending on who was watching and from where. We talked about how the film's emotional resonance wasn't an accident, but the product of 1,000 small, interlocking decisions across writing, performance, and craft. And then we went further, into the machinery of it all, the production choices, the cinematography, the sound design, the editing rhythms that shaped our emotional engagement without ever calling attention to themselves. We marveled at how the setting wasn't just backdrop, but a breathing character in its own right, how the spaces and light and textures reinforced the story's inner logic. We saw how every department spoke to the others, how cohesion became a kind of invisible glue holding the whole work together. When we pulled back the curtain on the set itself, we found a world buzzing with collaboration. Cast and crew forging bonds over long nights and early calls, improvising solutions when challenges appeared, and building a shared language for the story they were telling. Those little anecdotes, funny, touching, sometimes frustrating, added dimension to the finished product we saw. It's one thing to admire a scene on screen, it's another to understand the sweat and laughter and compromise that went into making it. From there we returned to the deeper waters of meaning. We unpacked themes that gave the narrative its backbone: identity, time, moral ambiguity, love's fragility, the way personal histories haunt the present. We examined the symbols, visual and narrative, that gave these ideas texture, how recurring imagery became emotional shorthand, and how small details carried the weight of unspoken truths. We understood that the story's richness lay not just in what it showed us, but in what it trusted us to infer. Finally, we lingered on the technical artistry, how the film's form was in constant conversation with its content. Camera movements weren't just visual flair, they were emotional punctuation. Sound wasn't just something to fill silence, it was silence's partner, defining its edges. Editing wasn't simply a means of assembly. It was a tool for shaping perception. And all of this existed alongside the very real business of cinema, the calculated risk of making a work that might not appeal to everyone, but could mean everything to the right audience. Now here we are, with the journey laid out behind us like a map we've drawn together. It's tempting, after all this, to talk about the film in terms of what it meant, but maybe the more interesting question is what it did, to you, to me, to the way we think about stories. Because films like this don't end when the credits roll, they echo. They sit in the corner of your mind and wait, and then on some quiet afternoon or sleepless night, they rise again, bringing with them the weight and wonder of the first viewing. If you've made it this far with me, you know this isn't just about one film. It's about the joy of slowing down and really looking, about the way cinema can be both a mirror and a window, about the shared act of seeing. I hope this journey has given you something, an insight, a new way of thinking, or simply the pleasure of sinking into a story with someone who loves it as much as you do. And if it has, then I'd like to invite you to keep going with me. There are so many more films to wander through, so many worlds to step into and ideas to unearth. Subscribe if you haven't already, not just to get the next video, but to be part of a space where we approach cinema like the living, breathing art form it is. Bring your thoughts, your disagreements, your own interpretations. After all, stories grow richer when they're shared, because in the end, that's what all of this is about, not the solitary act of watching, but the communal act of understanding. And I can't wait to see where we go next.